Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, a podcast about people in the fintech space who are thinking through problems very clearly and are enjoying uncommon outcomes as a result of that. I'm Dr. Alice Elizabeth Wilson, founder and CEO of Uncommon, a specialist research and communication studio serving fintech clients. In each episode, I sit down with someone who I think is brilliant to steal their ideas, insights, and mental models for my own benefit, and now also for yours. Okay, so we are joined today by Mindy Anderson. Mindy, I would love to hand over to you and ask you to introduce yourself in a way that feels the most interesting and relevant to you today.
Thank you for having me. Mindy Anderson. I am an on-demand CMO, which means that I work with companies on a needed basis when they need to set their global marketing strategy or national marketing strategy. And I typically work with management consulting companies, fintech, financial services, and software as a service. I have worked in enterprises throughout most of my career. In the past 2.5 years, I've worked with many startups as well as mid-market companies.
Am I right in thinking that your marketing history in the fintech and SaaS areas spans back at least 15 years?
Yes, I don't want to age myself, of course, but I've been in financial services for more than 20 years. I started writing out all of the websites and the brochures and the materials for financial advisors. So I've written to B2B, B2C, and financial advisors in regards to mutual funds, ETFs, hedge funds, and real estate investment trusts, and everything and anything in between.
I'd really love to hear you talk a little bit about what you see as being the single biggest difference in what your role demands of you now, today, in the current fintech environment versus when you were first cutting your teeth 20 years ago.
Initially, everything was traditional marketing, meaning it was more direct mail, it was more face-to-face events. Over time, things have increasingly become more digital, and increasingly we've seen a lot of fintechs and apps coming out, and it's not really slowing down, especially when we had the pandemic. 2021 kind of marked a new opening, if you will, and a trajectory for fintechs, meaning that what happened was everybody was becoming more inclined to download apps on their phone for fintech, specifically for digital payments, open banking, cryptocurrency, fraud alerts. I mean, there's so many different categories within the fintech space. What that means, though, is that I would say there's a digital shift that went from more of a desktop to eventually to mobile and then to apps specifically. So having an understanding from a marketing standpoint as well as a UX research standpoint of what do end users want to experience in that app and how seamless is it or not is very important and a business imperative for companies to take the time to understand how to ensure that end-to-end experience is seamless. It's easy for them to understand prompts. It's easy for them to understand how to move from one window to the next window. It also should really feel personalized. We went from a world where we went from, I think, general marketing to segmented marketing to personalization. And so there's a lot of digital expectations that as end users, it doesn't matter if you're a business or a consumer, that there is an expectation that you already understand their personality and their likes, their dislikes, and their risk tolerance and their financial goals. So there's a lot of expectations oftentimes that if you have experienced a best-in-class app or website, and then you go to another fintech or website that does not give you that same experience, there's a likelihood you will have churn, right? Because the expectation has already been higher and then it dropped. So the digital machine learning and digital end-to-end experience is critical for companies to succeed in today's world.
Yeah, I've seen a huge focus myself as well on personalization specifically that moves way beyond segmented email lists and sort of like curated landing pages and so on. I see it more in retail banking customers and sort of investment management firms that deal with retail level access, because I think that Gen X and like younger millennials are really driving that strong appetite for highly personalized messaging and this feeling of moving away from corporate to human interaction and really reaching for a human to human interaction. And I anticipate, here's my hypothesis, that over the next 10 to 15 years, we will see that trend travel upwards from the retail level into the institutional investor level as that cohort ages up through the wealth building and investment and like fintech usage process through that timeline, if you like. I wonder if you've noticed any patterns yourself in like where this appetite and demand for personalization is coming from and where it's being slower to be adapted.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because so we moved out of New York and I'm in a country setting now. And just that experience personally for myself, I can tell you the banking is wildly different, like apples and oranges. So I came from an environment of Chase and Citi and Wells Fargo, the very large financial institutions. Now I do have those sort of banks around here, but it's also much more common to see a small bank and a credit union. And what that means for fintechs is that they have to really also speak to those different audiences. So the way that Chase City, Wells Fargo will handle their business, their website, their apps is very different from a credit union. And anyone who's ever gone into a credit union, knows that it's not a 5-minute experience. It's you're in a country setting, people expect that relationship. They want to be handheld. They still use a lot of traditional measures from 20 years ago, where I first started out in financial services. So, what I think is antiquated is not necessarily antiquated for other parts of the world. And when you're in a remote setting or not as heavily populated area, you see the generational needs where somebody who is, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, who wants to see the same person at the bank or a credit union, and they want someone to physically sit down with them. Whereas people who have been using computers and cell phones and technology and have a higher expectation of faster and end-to-end experiences will want to have, I want to make a bill payment and I want it to be done in 30 seconds. So there's wildly different expectations as well from somebody who still writes a check versus somebody who wants to do it on their phone or on the website and have it be completed with a very short window. And I'm one of those people. I went from having a large bank to having that very quick interaction to now I have a credit union. And I often find myself frustrated because the experience is very clunky. It's not user friendly. There's third party integrations that don't feel seamless. And you're going from one website to another website. And sometimes you're not quite sure within each window to the next window where you are, and what you're seeking to click on is not being represented. So you're in a bit of searching mode for something that for most people at this point in time would think should be served up to you right away, and it's not. So I do see the need for the small banks and credit unions to operationalize and step into more of a digital transformation mindset in order to scale up their own businesses. What that means when they don't necessarily appeal to the younger generation or to people who want that digital end-to-end experience is that they will experience churn even if they want a community bank, right? Because on one personal human side, they want the human interaction and they want to be taken care of with customer service. And there's an association, I think, with the credit unions and small banks to have more customer service. So that may feel personally satisfying. On a standpoint, if you have different side incomes or different business streams and your time needs to be very efficient, you just cannot afford to waste 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, whatever the case would be, for some financial resolution to come to light. And so that's where if that frustration goes high enough, that the small banks and the credit unions will ultimately lose those customers.
That's such a good point about the difference between rural and urban cultures around fintech and financial services. I wonder what you think about what the driving force behind this slower uptake and adaptation from, for example, credit unions and smaller banks is. Do you think it's a budget issue? Do you think it's like a cultural and awareness issue? It strikes me as unlikely that they wouldn't have the expertise and data to realize that these, like you said, clunky projects are causing churn and costing them revenue.
I have witnessed myself, it's a mindset. It's absolutely a mindset that is a threaded needle throughout the whole culture, no matter which location you may go into. Growing up in the metropolitan area with people, they move fast. There's a lot of beeping horns. There's impatience. There's tenacity. There's an eagerness to conquer the world in New York City, right? And anyone who's been to New York City
Yeah.
feels that energy where everybody's on a mission to do something. And then when you're in the country, people drive slow, may not realize that they cut you off. So you see the attention span is very different and it's slower because you're in a slower lifestyle. And it translates into even the banking and the credit unions. And so I think part of it is the lifestyle, number one, and the energy or lack thereof based on where you live. And I think it's also the expectation of if you've been brought up in a certain way of life, that's normal to you, right? If you were brought up in New York City, you think that fast pace is what the world is supposed to be like. But if you were brought up in a country setting with maybe 100 people within 100 miles of you, then you think the world is also just like that. So the expectations and your own DNA as a person will go into that. And then the culture, of course, of what the CEO and the values of each company and how that company wants to be perceived in the market, as well as how fluent is the cross collaboration within the company itself. So on the back end, people are not necessarily thinking about the back end of the operations and marketing and sales and customer service. But that go-to-market strategy, if it's not seamless on the back end, will bleed over to the front end, meaning that the customers will catch on eventually and see those cracks in the operations and the lack of processes in place. So when you have a sophisticated customer or business owner, for example, which is very different from somebody who maybe has a few $100s in the bank, you have to also adapt to those different business needs or customer needs as a credit union or a bank. The thing is, in these digital times, if you have an Etsy store and another business, just say you have two businesses, right? You cannot afford to have your credit card system down. So just painting a picture of what does it look like in a day-to-day's life of somebody who's in the world right now, probably working on two different incomes, perhaps. So can the credit union and the small bank provide the same level of service for that small business owner? Probably not. Are they willing to operationalize themselves and modernize their digital end-to-end system to get to a place where they can serve small businesses in a seamless approach, the same way that bigger banks are? Hopefully, because if they don't, the problem is that even if they want to scale, they will not be able to scale.
Yeah, that's a really great analysis you've just given there. And I wanted to pick up on this comment that you made about if the back end is not cohesive, then those disjointed experiences will bleed through into the front end and the customers will feel and learn this and will likely churn out to a different, easier provider. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the most common problems that your clients come to you to solve. Is there something that comes up again and again, or is it sort of like different flavors for each client?
Well, this year, the resonating theme is that every single company is looking for more customers and more closed-won business. Everybody's looking for the right pipeline, and everyone's looking to close the business. And across the globe, there's definitely a slower pace of of closed-won business. There's a slower pace of customers, businesses, or B2C moving into the funnel. There's a lot of mistrust with people across the globe. We have been in a largely politically charged landscape for a long time. There's been a lot of chaos since the pandemic, and people don't feel confident about the world, I think, which I think bleeds into people's comfort level, into pulling the trigger and choosing to move forward with a company, even if they need it. So I don't think it's necessarily about the company. Sometimes I think it's more about, there's a lot of global mistrust happening with different things that have been happening across the globe. And I think a lot of people don't want to feel like they have to have their hand in politics. And sometimes the world is making them feel like it's constantly being represented on the news, and people just kind of want to carry on with their lives. I think there's a little bit of that going on the backside. Just a psychological, I think, observation from my standpoint.
It's sort of serendipitous. I was having a version of this conversation just yesterday with a friend of mine, Andrew, from a FinTech PR company called Water and Wall, I think they're called. And we were talking about how in the business environment, we perceive and feel in our own businesses that there's been a kind of psychological recession, even though the baseline macroeconomics have remained fairly stable. You know, there was lots of predictions towards the end of last year about there's going to be an actual, you know, like GDP recession. And because that was being talked about and discussed so much, it became an internalized narrative that impacted the way people were behaving and spending, not enough to cause an actual like bottom line recession, but definitely enough to have a noticeable trend of recession-like behavior in terms of signing new contracts, requests for proposals, having the confidence to move forward with, exactly like you said, partnering with companies that they need to partner with, but just feeling that unsettling, that disturbed level of shaken confidence and trust, which we associate with recession-type environments, even though it hasn't actually happened.
And I think across the board, I'm seeing people's need, including myself. I have to admit that we're all looking for a guaranteed ROI. And I don't think anyone can guarantee that ROI with so much uncertainty, right? You know, when you work with a company, there's people who, they're going to look for integrity. They're going to look for excellence. They're going to look for competency. There's going to be core values, I think, that need to shine through. I think companies that will win the race from a pipeline standpoint and an acquisition standpoint will build that relationship with integrity and with excellence and with competency, right? And, you know, whatever their core values are, I think when I talk to companies, I remind them, build the relationship first, create trust, create relatability, create an understanding to their circumstances, and be the trusted partner that when they're ready, they know that you can deliver on. So the process will take longer because of the mistrust in the market overall. And so what that means from a digital standpoint is it used to be that there was probably, 10 on average touch points maybe before, maybe 10 years ago, for someone to maybe get some emails, read the website, look at a brochure, maybe attend an event or a webinar. Now people will listen to a podcast. They're going to read a whole bunch of emails. They're going to download a thought leadership piece. They're going to look at your scores online on, do you have trust with your customers, or are people talking poorly about your company or your practices or lack thereof of best practices? I think people are really being much more diligent, and before they take that dive to really, they're going through a lot of measures to ensure that you are the right business for them.
Yeah. I'd love to get your opinion and analysis on some of the best marketing campaigns or projects that you have ever been involved with yourself. Are there any that really stand out in your mind as excellence bar none in FinTech marketing?
I would say I had the most fun personally. I don't know if I would say it's the best in the world, but I had the most fun when I worked for City Investment Management, working on women focused campaigns. And the reason why I think it's so important, and why it was so fun, was blending the day-to-day human beings of women in investing, as using creative that just shows a woman who wants to go do her yoga class, but she still wants to have balance in her financial life, right? And so those were the sort of creative images that I had used for the global campaign. And the reason why is because yoga kind of can give you that personal balance. But a lot of women I speak to even today, they don't know how to pay their bills online, or they don't know how to budget from month to month, or they have let their husband take care of their finances and they don't know what to do if something happens. So they don't have a backup plan. So I still feel that this is such a personal issue that I think needs to constantly be educated about to women, that they can't push it under the rug or forget about it or just hope that it disappears. Like, unfortunately, that's just not going to be helpful to you one day when you do need to know what to do with your finances. So I've always taken a lot of care to write to women specifically about, it's one step at a time. Just educate yourself on the basics, and then the more you learn, the more you'll feel more confident to move into a higher level of your financial prowess, your financial ability to navigate your bills versus your goals, and to have a North Star. It's really very similar to having a portfolio. It's really very similar to having a business portfolio, right? Like, there's got to be a North Star, but you've got to start somewhere. The campaign that I did for women on achieving their financial goals and striking that balance in their life is very important to me as a woman, and it's very important, I think, to women across the globe.
I really love that you've brought that up, Mindy. It's a topic that's extremely close to my heart and to my own training and the academic part of my life. I completed my doctorate this year. I graduated from my PhD program last month, in fact. And my entire thesis, 250,000 words in the end, thank you, were dedicated to examining exactly this problem, the financial independence of women and what the life outcomes are as a result of the fact that, for example, women are less likely to be granted a mortgage because of wage inequality, and that most retail level banks will lend approximately 5 times an annual salary. But because women's median earnings are sort of a third to 50% lower on a population level, on aggregate, than single men, it becomes incredibly hard, if not impossible, for women to live alone specifically, which means that very often they will have to partner in order to have somewhere to live. And they don't have the financial independence that means they could leave that living situation, that relationship, if they wanted to. Women also retire with pension pots that are, on average, a third the size of a man's retirement pot, because women are responsibilized for so much unpaid labor throughout the life course. Women tend to be the caregivers that will leave the paid workforce and enter the unpaid workforce to do the essential labor of social reproduction, of raising and teaching and looking after and cleaning and keeping alive our next population of laborers and human beings. And they are also much less likely to invest. I think this is a confidence issue. And I also think that finance is a masculinized phenomena. When we think of finance, we tend to think of more masculinized qualities. And these sort of layers of deprivation and inequality compound to make women's life outcomes very precarious and dangerous, in fact. So my entire thesis is about this. And I am now also moving into looking to work specifically with female founded fintech companies and femme health tech kind of organizations too, so that I can use my academic expertise and personal interest alongside my business imperatives to make some good progress here. So I love that we have that in common. I just want to bring the conversation to a close with a final question, Mindy, which is, what do you think makes content creation, quality content creation, in the fintech space different from any other area of marketing, from any other industry?
I think it's different because it's still in transformation mode, right? There's so much happening, and there's a good 15 topics within fintech space right now that are exploding. Whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's open banking, whether it's financial fraud. Like there's so many, and then credit scores and all these new companies coming to light. So that makes it even more important for that brand differentiation and the distinction of a company's personality and DNA to stand out. So I have always stepped into the role of branding a company and defining what makes them distinct from their competitors, because oftentimes a company cannot answer that question. So a really good marketing leader will be able to come in, cut through the noise, look at that company, do a SWOT analysis, and realize this is your competitive advantage. And this is what we're going to stand tall with. This is our power messaging or our secret sauce.
I love that. That's a great response. Thank you. Tell me, Mindy, when people want to learn more about you or find out how they can work with you, where would you like them to go? Where's the best place for people to get in touch with you?
You can check out my website. It's IBreatheMarketing.net, or you can always reach me on LinkedIn, Mindy Anderson, and my email is IBreatheMarketing@gmail.com.
Fantastic. I will also link to all of those good resources in the show notes underneath this podcast for anybody listening. Mindy, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Uncommon Knowledge. I hope you learned something new or got an unfamiliar way to look at a familiar problem. Until next time, I wish you all good things, and I'll catch you on the next episode.